Evelyn Carter tightened her scarf against the biting wind as she stepped off the creaking bus. Frostwood lay before her, a quaint snow-covered village glowing with Christmas cheer. Twinkling lights draped the cottages, and the scent of pine mingled with the distant sound of carolers. It was picturesque, a perfect holiday postcard. But Evelyn wasn't here for the magic. She was here for a deadline. "Welcome to Frostwood," chirped the driver, tipping his hat. "Hope you enjoy our famous festival." Evelyn offered a tight smile, gripping her suitcase. "Thanks. I'll try." The village square bustled with activity. Children laughed as they built snowmen, and vendors sold steaming mugs of mulled cider. Yet, beneath the surface, Evelyn felt an odd stillness, as if the air itself were watching her. She checked into the Frostwood Inn, a rustic building with creaky wooden floors and a roaring fireplace in the lobby. The innkeeper, a wiry woman named Mrs. Crane, handed her the room key. "You're here for the festival?" Mrs. Crane asked, her eyes flicking to the recorder in Evelyn's hand. "Partly," Evelyn replied. "I'm also interested in local legends. I heard there's some unusual history here." Mrs. Crane's smile faltered. "We don't talk about that," she said curtly, then softened her tone. "Enjoy the festival, dear. Stay close to the lights, and don't wander into the forest." Evelyn frowned. "Why not?" "It's so easy to get lost," Mrs. Crane replied, though her tone suggested there was more to it. As night fell, Evelyn couldn't resist exploring the village. She strolled down cobblestone streets, lined with glowing lanterns. Everything was too perfect, too pristine, like a scene staged for her arrival. Then she saw it. At the edge of the square stood a towering Christmas tree, its ornaments glinting like stars. But among the baubles and tinsel, Evelyn noticed something strange. An old, rusted bell hung from one of the branches. Unlike the other decorations, it looked ancient and out of place. A chill ran down her spine. She leaned closer, brushing snow from the bell. As her fingers touched the cold metal, a whisper tickled her ear. "Silent night. Holy night." Evelyn spun around, but no one was there. Only the wind howled through the empty square. She stepped back, heart pounding as the bell gave a soft, haunting clang. The morning in Frostwood was deceptively serene. Evelyn woke to the soft glow of sunlight reflecting off the snow outside her window. The town square below bustled with preparations for the Christmas Eve festival. It was the picture of joy, yet Evelyn couldn't shake the memory of the bell and the whisper from the night before. Determined to uncover more, she dressed quickly, grabbed her notebook, and headed out. The innkeeper, Mrs. Crane, intercepted her in the lobby. "You're up early, Miss Carter. Planning to join the festivities today?" Evelyn hesitated. "Actually, I was hoping to learn more about the history of Frostwood. Maybe speak to some locals?" Mrs. Crane's cheery demeanor faltered, ever so slightly. "The festival is all the history you need. The rest, well, some things are best left in the past." Before Evelyn could press further, a sharp laugh from the square caught her attention. A group of children was playing near the giant Christmas tree. Their laughter rang through the crisp air, but something about their movements seemed off. Evelyn squinted, noticing a boy at the edge of the group standing eerily still. The boy stared at the snow beneath the tree, near his face pale. Evelyn approached cautiously. "What's wrong, kid?" she asked, her voice gentle. The boy didn't look up. He pointed to the ground. Evelyn followed his gaze and froze. There, pressed into the fresh snow, was a single set of footprints leading away from the tree, but they didn't belong to a human. The prints were elongated, almost claw-like, and they seemed to shimmer faintly in the sunlight. "Who made those?" Evelyn asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. The boy finally looked at her, his eyes wide with fear. "It's the shadow," he said. Evelyn felt a shiver run down her spine. "What shadow?" Before the boy could answer, his mother rushed over, scolding him and pulling him away. "Don't bother the nice lady, Toby," she said, shooting Evelyn an apologetic smile. "But, Mama, I saw it!" the boy protested. "It was standing there, by the tree." "That's enough!" his mother snapped, dragging him off. Evelyn stood there, her pulse quickening. She turned back to the footprints, but they were already fading, as if the snow itself was swallowing them whole. Determined to dig deeper, Evelyn visited the Frostwood Historical Society, a small building tucked behind the town square. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and wood polish. Shelves of dusty books lined the walls, and a small desk sat in the corner, manned by an elderly man with thick glasses. "Can I help you?" the man asked, peering at her over the rim of his spectacles. "I'm looking for information about the town's history," Evelyn said, "particularly any legends or stories tied to Christmas." The man's face darkened. "Not much to tell," he said quickly. "Just old tales to scare children. Nothing worth digging into." Evelyn wasn't convinced. "What about the shadow?" she pressed. The man's hand froze mid-reach for a book. He turned to her slowly, his expression unreadable. "Who told you about that?" "A boy by the Christmas tree. He said he saw it." The man sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "It's just a story," he said. "The villagers say it comes every 100 years, but no one's seen it." "Not really?" "But you believe it?" Evelyn said, watching him closely. He hesitated. "I've been here long enough to know that some stories have truth in them, even if we don't want to admit it." He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "If you value your safety, Miss Carter, leave Frostwood before Christmas Eve. No good has ever come from staying." Evelyn returned to the inn, her thoughts racing. The town seemed peaceful, but there was an underlying tension she couldn't ignore. That night, as she sat by the window scribbling notes, she noticed movement outside. A dark figure was standing in the square, right beneath the Christmas tree. Heart pounding, Evelyn grabbed her coat and stepped outside. The figure didn't move as she approached. It was tall and cloaked in shadows, its features obscured. "Who are you?" Evelyn called, her voice trembling. The figure tilted its head as if studying her. Then, without warning, it raised an arm and pointed towards the forest beyond the village. A cold gust of wind whipped through the square, extinguishing the lanterns. Evelyn blinked, and the figure was gone. But in the snow, leading toward the forest, were those same claw-like footprints. Evelyn stared at the claw-like footprints leading into the forest. The icy wind bit at her face, but she couldn't tear her eyes away. The figure's silent gesture toward the woods replayed in her mind, urging her forward, despite the rising sense of dread. Armed with her phone's flashlight and her recorder, Evelyn ventured into the dense forest. The towering pines loomed over her like skeletal sentinels, their branches creaking in the wind. The snow muffled her footsteps, but the silence was oppressive. As she followed the tracks, she noticed strange marks carved into the tree trunks, symbols that resembled stars and spirals, interwoven with jagged lines. They glowed faintly, as if charged with some unseen energy. Her recorder crackled to life unexpectedly, emitting a soft, static hum. She paused and raised it to her mouth. "December 22nd, she whispered. following strange tracks into the woods, unknown symbols on trees. No sign of the figure. Suddenly, the static intensified and a faint voice broke through. Turn back. Evelyn froze. Hello? She called into the darkness, her voice trembling. Who's there? The recorder hissed, then went silent. After what felt like hours, Evelyn stumbled into a clearing. At its center stood an old, crumbling chapel, its roof sagging under the weight of snow. The stained glass windows were intact, but oddly distorted, their colors muted and warped. Her flashlight flickered, then died, leaving her in near total darkness. The moonlight barely illuminated the chapel, but Evelyn could make out a faint glow from within. She pushed open the heavy wooden door, its hinges groaning in protest. The air inside was colder than outside, and the faint scent of decay made her stomach churn. Rows of pews stretched toward the altar, which was draped in tattered red fabric. Atop it sat a familiar object, a blackened bell, identical to the one she had seen on the Christmas tree. Her heart raced as she approached. The bell seemed to hum softly, its surface pulsating as if alive. She reached out hesitantly, her fingers mere inches from the bell, when a low, guttural growl echoed through the chapel. Spinning around, Evelyn saw it, the shadowy figure from the square. But now it was no longer cloaked in darkness. It was humanoid, but twisted, its limbs unnaturally long, and its face featureless except for hollow, glowing eyes. It moved slowly, deliberately, each step accompanied by the faint crunch of snow beneath its feet. Evelyn backed away, her pulse pounding in her ears. She grabbed the recorder and whispered, I don't know what this thing is, but it's real. It's real! And it's coming. The figure lunged, its clawed hand swiping at her. Evelyn ducked and bolted for the door, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The creature's growls grew louder, closer, as she sprinted into the forest. The snow was deeper now, slowing her down, but adrenaline kept her moving. Behind her, the shadowy figure glided effortlessly, its glowing eyes fixed on her. She tripped over a fallen branch and tumbled into the snow. Scrambling to her feet, she noticed the symbols on the trees glowing brighter, as if responding to her fear. Desperate, she grabbed a handful of snow and smeared it across one of the glowing marks. To her surprise, the light dimmed, and the creature hesitated, its growl softening. Evelyn didn't stop to think. She wiped out more symbols as she ran, each one causing the creature to slow. But it didn't stop entirely. It was relentless, its presence a constant shadow at the edge of her vision. Bursting out of the forest, Evelyn found herself back in the village square. The lights on the Christmas tree were flickering erratically, and the bell at its center was ringing softly, as if stirred by an invisible hand. The villagers had gathered, their faces pale and fearful. Mrs. Crane stood at the forefront, her expression grim. It's too late, she murmured. Evelyn staggered forward, breathless. What is that thing? What's happening? Mrs. Crane sighed heavily. The curse. You've seen it now. It won't stop until it takes what it's owed. What does it want? Evelyn demanded. Before Mrs. Crane could answer, the shadowy figure emerged from the forest, its form towering and more defined. The villagers gasped, some falling to their knees in prayer. The bell on the tree began to toll louder, its sound echoing through the square. Evelyn clutched her ears, the noise unbearable. The creature stopped, its gaze locked on her. It wants you, Mrs. Crane said, her voice barely audible. The tolling bell grew deafening, and Evelyn felt a crushing weight settle over her chest. The shadowy figure advanced slowly, its glowing eyes locked on her. Around her, the villagers whispered prayers, their voices trembling with fear. Evelyn turned to Mrs. Crane, her voice sharp with desperation. "What does it want from me? What is this curse?" Mrs. Crane's hands trembled as she clasped them tightly. "The shadow comes for those who disturb the peace of the curse. It's been this way for centuries. You touched the bell, didn't you?" Evelyn nodded, her stomach sinking. "Then it's marked you," Mrs. Crane whispered. "The bell binds you to it now." The shadow stopped mere feet away, its presence radiating a suffocating cold. It tilted its head, its clawed hand reaching toward Evelyn. "I didn't mean to disturb anything," Evelyn cried. "Intent doesn't matter," Mrs. Crane said grimly. "You've woken it, and now it demands restitution." The villagers stepped back as the shadow raised its arms. A chilling wind swept through the square, extinguishing every light except for the faint glow of the cursed bell. Evelyn's heart pounded. "What happens if I don't give it what it wants?" Mrs. Crane hesitated before answering, her voice barely above a whisper. "The village will pay. It always does." The shadow's claws extended, shimmering faintly in the moonlight. Evelyn felt a strange pull in her chest, as if something deep within her was being drawn toward the creature. "No," she said, stepping back. "There has to be another way." An elderly man stepped forward from the crowd, his face gaunt with age and regret. "There is," he said, his voice rasping. "The chapel. The bell inside was its anchor, long before this one appeared. Destroy the original, and you might sever the curse." The villagers gasped. Mrs. Crane turned to the man, her expression a mixture of shock and anger. "You know what happened the last time someone tried that, Elder Morris. The storm, the deaths. We're all going to die anyway if she doesn't stop it," the old man retorted. Evelyn latched on to the faint hope. "Where is the original bell?" Mrs. Crane sighed. "It's still in the chapel, buried beneath the altar, but you'll never make it there alone." The shadow let out a guttural roar, its claws slashing through the air. Evelyn didn't need further encouragement. She turned and ran, her path lit only by the faint glow of the cursed bell behind her. The forest was darker than before, the glowing symbols on the trees now pulsing with malevolent energy. The shadow pursued her relentlessly, its growls echoing through the trees. Evelyn stumbled but kept running, clutching the recorder in her hand. It crackled to life once more, the same faint voice whispering, "Hurry! Who are you?" Evelyn shouted into the recorder. "Why are you helping me?" No answer came, only static. When she reached the chapel, she slammed the door shut behind her, bracing it with a fallen pew. The shadow's footsteps slowed, circling the building. Inside, the glow from the symbols illuminated the altar. Evelyn approached cautiously, her breath visible in the frigid air. The fabric covering the altar seemed to ripple as she touched it, revealing a hidden compartment underneath. She pried it open, her fingers numb from the cold. Beneath the altar lay a bell, larger and more ancient than the one in the square. Its surface was blackened and cracked, etched with the same symbols she'd seen on the trees. The moment she touched it, a searing pain shot through her hand. Voices filled the room, overlapping whispers that spoke in a language she couldn't understand. The chapel door rattled violently. The shadow was trying to break in. Evelyn knew she didn't have much time. She grabbed the bell and dragged it to the center of the chapel. It felt heavier than it should have, as if it resisted her every movement. "Come on!" she muttered through gritted teeth. The door splintered, and the shadow forced its way inside. Its hollow eyes burned brighter, and it let out an ear-piercing shriek that made Evelyn's vision blur. With a final effort, she swung the bell onto the stone floor, shattering it into pieces. The effect was immediate. The shadow froze mid-stride, its form flickering like a dying flame. The symbols on the walls dimmed, and the oppressive cold lifted. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the shadow let out a final, mournful wail before disintegrating into ash. Evelyn staggered out of the chapel, her body aching and her mind reeling. The village square was eerily quiet when she returned. The cursed bell on the tree had vanished, leaving no trace of its existence. The villagers emerged from their homes cautiously, their faces filled with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Mrs. Crane approached Evelyn, her expression softening. "You did it?" she said quietly. Evelyn nodded, though she felt no triumph. "It's over." Mrs. Crane placed a hand on her shoulder. "You broke the curse, but Frostwood will never forget, and neither will you." Evelyn looked back toward the forest, where the faint glow of the symbols had finally faded. But as she turned to leave the village, a single question lingered in her mind. Was the curse truly broken, or had it simply shifted its gaze elsewhere? The bus rattled down the snow-covered road, carrying Evelyn away from Frostwood. She sat at the very back, staring out the window, her reflection blending with the blurred landscape. Despite the warm air blowing from the bus's heater, she felt an icy chill deep in her bones, a cold that no amount of distance seemed to shake. The villagers had said their goodbyes in hushed tones, grateful yet distant, as if they feared the curse's reach might extend to her even now. Evelyn couldn't blame them. Part of her felt the same. As the village disappeared from view, she leaned her head against the cold glass and closed her eyes. But the moment she drifted into sleep, the nightmares began. In her dream, Evelyn was back in Frostwood, standing before the Christmas tree. The cursed bell had returned, its blackened surface gleaming in the moonlight. Around her, the villagers were frozen in place, their faces locked in expressions of terror. The shadow emerged from the forest, its hollow eyes blazing. This time it spoke, not in words, but in a low, resonating hum that filled her chest with dread. "You broke the anchor," it seemed to say. "But the curse is not bound by place. It is bound by you." Evelyn woke with a start, her breath coming in gasps. The bus driver glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "You okay back there?" She nodded quickly, wiping the sweat from her brow. "Yeah, just a bad dream." But as she glanced at her reflection in the window, she swore she saw a faint pair of glowing eyes watching her from the darkness beyond. A week later, Evelyn was back in her cramped apartment in the city. The warmth of the Christmas season surrounded her. The streets were lined with twinkling lights. Carolers sang on corners, and storefronts displayed cheerful holiday scenes. But, for Evelyn, the cheer felt hollow. She spent her days trying to write the article about Frostwood, but the words wouldn't come. Every time she tried to describe the village's traditions, her mind drifted back to the shadow, the cursed bell, and the villagers' fear. The nightmares continued. Each night she saw the shadow, its glowing eyes closer than before. The whispers followed her even when she was awake, faint but unmistakable. Her recorder, which she had brought back from Frostwood, crackled to life at odd hours, playing fragments of the whispers she had heard in the chapel. She tried throwing it away, but it reappeared on her desk the next morning, its battery drained yet still functioning. It was on Christmas Eve, exactly 1 week after her return, that Evelyn noticed it. She was getting ready for bed when she caught sight of her reflection in the mirror. At first glance, everything seemed normal. But as she leaned closer, she saw it, a faint mark on her collarbone, shaped like one of the symbols from the trees in Frostwood. Her heart raced. She rubbed at the mark, hoping it was just a trick of the light or a smear of dirt, but it didn't budge. It seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. The whispers grew louder that night. Frostwood was silent. The festive decorations were gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. Snow covered the square, undisturbed by footprints, and the giant Christmas tree stood bare, its branches stark against the gray sky. She headed straight for the chapel, her every step echoing in the quiet. Inside the chapel was darker than before, its interior colder and more foreboding. The altar where she had destroyed the bell was empty, but the air was thick with the same oppressive energy. "Why am I here?" she demanded, her voice echoing through the empty space. The symbols on the walls began to glow faintly, and the whispers swirled around her. A familiar voice broke through the cacophony. It was Elder Morris. "You carry the mark," the voice said, though the elder was nowhere to be seen. "The curse doesn't die. It only changes shape. You must decide now. Will you carry it, or will you pass it on?" "What does that mean?" Evelyn shouted. The glow intensified, and the shadow appeared at the back of the chapel. This time, it spoke clearly, its voice a deep, resonating growl. "Choose," it said. Evelyn's breath hitched as the shadow stood motionless at the back of the chapel, its glowing eyes fixed on her. The weight of its demand crushed her chest. "Choose," it repeated, its voice reverberating in her skull. "What do you mean?" Evelyn asked, her voice trembling. "Choose what?" The shadow extended its claw-like hand toward her, its fingers curling as if beckoning. The symbols on the walls pulsed in unison, filling the chapel with an eerie, rhythmic light. The elder's disembodied voice returned, speaking as though from within her mind. "The curse binds itself to a soul. It needs a host to feed upon, to sustain its existence. Destroying the bell severed its tether to Frostwood, but you became its anchor." Evelyn's heart sank. "Why me?" "Because you disturbed its slumber," the elder replied. "Now, you must either carry the burden or pass it to another." The shadow's eyes flared brighter, and the chapel seemed to shrink, the walls closing in. Evelyn staggered back, panic coursing through her veins. "What happens if I carry it?" she whispered. The elder's voice turned somber. "It will haunt you until the end of your days. Your dreams, your thoughts, your very soul will no longer be your own. But the village, and all others, will be spared." "And if I pass it on?" Evelyn asked, though she already feared the answer. The shadow stepped closer, its presence a wall of cold. The elder spoke again, his tone filled with regret. "If you pass it, the curse will begin anew, claiming another village, another family. Innocence will suffer as Frostwood has suffered." Evelyn's mind raced. She thought of the villagers, of the fear etched into their faces. She thought of the children playing by the Christmas tree, of the mother who had shielded her son. But she also thought of herself, her life, her dreams, her freedom. Could she sacrifice everything to save a town that had tried to hide its sins from her? The shadow raised its hand, and an image appeared in the air between them. Evelyn saw a bustling city square filled with families celebrating Christmas. Lights twinkled and laughter echoed through the streets. "This is where it will go!" the shadow intoned, its voice low and resonant. "Should you choose to pass it?" Evelyn's stomach churned. She recognized the square. It was in her hometown. The curse wasn't bound to Frostwood anymore. It could strike anywhere. No, she said firmly. I won't do it. I won't pass it on. The shadow froze, its glowing eyes narrowing. The chapel shuddered, and the symbols on the walls flared brilliantly, casting sharp shadows across the room. Then you will bear it, the shadow growled. Evelyn felt an unbearable pain radiate through her chest as the shadow reached out and touched her. A searing heat burned into the mark on her collarbone, and she screamed, collapsing to the ground. The whispers grew louder, deafening. As the shadow's form dissolved into a swirling mass of darkness that enveloped her. The pain was blinding, and for a moment, Evelyn thought she would die. But then, just as quickly as it began, the darkness receded. She lay on the cold stone floor, gasping for breath. The chapel was silent. The symbols on the walls had disappeared, leaving only bare, cracked stone. Evelyn sat up slowly, her body trembling. She felt different, heavier, as though the weight of the world had settled on her shoulders. You have chosen, the elder's voice whispered faintly, fading into the ether. Evelyn returned to the village square, her steps unsteady. The villagers watched her approach, their faces etched with a mix of awe and fear. Mrs. Crane stepped forward cautiously. You took it? Evelyn nodded, her voice hollow. The curse is mine now. The villagers exchanged glances, some murmuring prayers, others bowing their heads in gratitude. You've saved us, Mrs. Crane said, tears glistening in her eyes. Frostwood will never forget your sacrifice. But Evelyn couldn't find a solace in their gratitude. She felt the curse within her, a cold, gnawing presence that whispered in the back of her mind. It wasn't over, not for her. Days later, Evelyn boarded a bus back to the city. She didn't know what awaited her, but she knew her life would never be the same. The whispers followed her everywhere now, growing louder at night. Shadows danced at the edges of her vision, and her reflection sometimes smiled when she didn't. Christmas came and went, but Evelyn no longer felt the warmth of the season. She kept to herself, afraid to let anyone get too close. As the new year began, she sat by her window, staring at the snow-covered streets below. A faint smile tugged at her lips as she realized something chilling. The curse wasn't just feeding on her, it was waiting, growing stronger. And one day, it would want more. In Frostwood, the villagers celebrated their first peaceful Christmas in generations. The tree stood tall and bright, untainted by the cursed bell. But deep in the forest, beneath the roots of the ancient pines, a faint glow pulsed in the snow. The broken pieces of the original bell lay scattered, but their power hadn't faded entirely. And in the city, Evelyn awoke one night to find the recorder on her bedside table glowing faintly. The curse, it seemed, was far from finished. The days blurred into weeks, and Evelyn began to feel the curse's presence more acutely. It was no longer just a whisper in the night or a fleeting shadow in the corner of her eye. It was a constant, oppressive force. Everywhere she went, she felt its weight. The lights in her apartment flickered incessantly. Her phone buzzed with static-filled messages at odd hours, though no calls appeared in her logs. Objects moved ever so slightly when she wasn't looking. One night, while staring at her computer, she noticed her reflection in the darkened screen. It wasn't following her movements. Instead, it smiled, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. Evelyn pushed herself back from the desk, her heart racing. The reflection leaned closer, its lips moving soundlessly. She turned away, clutching her head. "Leave me alone." But the whispers didn't stop. Evelyn knew she couldn't live like this. She began researching ancient curses, scouring online forums, and consulting obscure texts in dusty libraries. Most of what she found was useless, old wives' tales and half-formed theories. But one fragment caught her attention. It was a passage from a forgotten tome. To sever a curse bound by a soul, one must confront the source and offer what it desires most. What it desires most, Evelyn muttered. Her mind raced. What could the curse possibly want? The answer came to her in a dream that night. She was back in the Frostwood Chapel, standing before the altar. The shadow loomed behind her, its voice resonating through the empty space. "Freedom!" it growled. "It desires freedom." Evelyn woke with a start. The room was cold, her breath visible in the air. The curse wasn't just feeding on her, it wanted release from its eternal cycle. Evelyn packed a bag and prepared for another journey, this time to uncover the truth about the curse's origins. If she could find the moment it was created, perhaps she could rewrite its ending. She returned to Frostwood, but the village was different. The people were kinder, more open, as if a great weight had been lifted. Mrs. Crane welcomed her back warmly, though her eyes betrayed a hint of concern. "I thought you'd left it behind," the innkeeper said as she poured Evelyn a cup of tea. "I can't," Evelyn replied. "Not until I find a way to end it." Mrs. Crane hesitated, then leaned closer. "There's one place you haven't seen, one place that might hold the answers you're looking for." Evelyn's interest piqued. "Where?" "The Beggar's Hollow," Mrs. Crane whispered. According to Frostwood legend, the curse began when a wandering beggar was turned away on Christmas Eve centuries ago. He had sought shelter from a terrible storm, but the villagers, afraid of his gaunt appearance and strange demeanor, barred their doors. Angered and betrayed, the beggar cursed Frostwood before disappearing into the forest. Evelyn followed Mrs. Crane's directions to the hollow, a secluded area deep in the woods. The journey was treacherous, the snow thick and unyielding. The forest felt alive, the trees groaning as if protesting her intrusion. When she reached the hollow, she found a crude stone altar surrounded by wilted evergreens. Symbols similar to those in the chapel were etched into the stones, but these were older, more intricate. In the center of the altar lay a tattered journal. The journal belonged to the beggar, its pages filled with rambling thoughts and arcane symbols. Evelyn flipped through carefully, her breath catching as she read a passage. "They cast me out, turned me away, but I will not die forgotten. My soul will linger, bound to the bell, until one chooses to take my place." Evelyn's hands trembled. The curse wasn't just a punishment, it was the beggar's revenge, a way to ensure he was never truly alone. Another passage caught her eye. "The bell is my prison, but it is also the key. Should one pure of heart offer their soul willingly, the cycle will end. I will be free, and so shall they." Evelyn's heart sank. It was a trap, a cruel bargain meant to snare the selfless. But if she didn't act, the curse would continue feeding, claiming her and eventually others. Evelyn returned to the chapel that night, journal in hand. She lit a single candle and placed it on the altar, the dim light casting long shadows across the room. "Show yourself," she said, her voice steady. "I know what you want." The shadow materialized slowly, its form more defined than ever. Its hollow eyes burned, and its voice rumbled like thunder. "You cannot stop it," it growled. "You are mine." Evelyn stepped forward, holding the journal high. "I know the truth. You're trapped, just like I am. But I can free you." The shadow hesitated, its form flickering. "I'll take your place," Evelyn said. But only if you promise to end the curse. No more anchors. No more victims. The shadow let out a guttural growl, the chapel shaking with its fury. But then it nodded slowly, its glowing eyes dimming. You would give yourself? It asked, its voice softer now, almost human. Evelyn nodded, tears streaming down her face. Yes, if it means no one else has to suffer. The shadow raised its hand, and the symbols on the walls blazed to life. Evelyn felt a rush of cold wind as the darkness engulfed her. For a moment, there was only pain, a deep, searing agony that tore through her soul. She saw flashes of the beggar's life, his rejection, his bitterness, his loneliness. Then, just as suddenly, the pain stopped. Evelyn opened her eyes to find herself standing in the middle of the chapel alone. The symbols were gone, and the oppressive cold had lifted. The shadow was nowhere to be seen. She looked down at her hands, half expecting to see them twisted and clawed, but they were unchanged. Yet, deep within her, she felt the faintest pulse of darkness, a reminder of the burden she now carried. Evelyn left Frostwood for the last time, her heart heavy, but her resolve firm. She had ended the curse's cycle, but at a cost she would bear forever. Back in the city, life resumed its rhythm, though Evelyn knew she was no longer the same. The whispers were gone. The shadows no longer danced in her periphery. But on quiet nights, when the world was still, she would hear the faint toll of a bell, a reminder of the choice she had made. And though the curse was broken, Evelyn knew she wasn't free. Not entirely, for now she was its keeper, the last guardian of a darkness that would sleep until it was needed again. Evelyn's new life, as the keeper of the curse, wasn't immediately apparent to anyone, not even to herself. The darkness within her remained quiet for weeks, letting her believe, if only for a moment, that she might have been freed from its grip. But subtle changes began to creep in. The city felt different, quieter. People on the street gave her a wide berth, as if sensing an invisible barrier around her. Animals avoided her entirely. Dogs whimpered and pulled at their leashes, and birds scattered whenever she walked by. Evelyn couldn't ignore the growing unease in her own heart. On more than one occasion, she'd caught herself staring into mirrors for minutes at a time, her own reflection feeling foreign. And then there were the dreams, vivid, haunting visions of Frostwood, of the shadow, and of the cursed bell ringing endlessly. The most disturbing change, however, came when Evelyn realized she could sense emotions: fear, anger, sorrow. Crowded places became overwhelming, the weight of others' struggles pressing on her chest like a vice. It wasn't until one fateful night, when Evelyn encountered a stranger in need, that she truly understood what it meant to be the keeper of the curse. Evelyn was walking home from work late one evening when she heard muffled sobs coming from a dark alleyway. Against her better judgment, she approached cautiously, her hand gripping her phone. A young woman sat on the ground, her face buried in her hands. Evelyn could feel the woman's anguish like a tangible force clawing at her chest. "Are you okay?" Evelyn asked, softly. The woman looked up, her tear-streaked face pale and trembling. I don't know what to do," she whispered. "Everything's falling apart. I don't think I can keep going." Evelyn's heart ached. She crouched beside the woman, instinctively reaching out to comfort her. But the moment her hand touched the woman's shoulder, a cold shiver ran through her body. A vision flashed before her eyes. The woman's struggles unfolded like a story. Lost opportunities, heartbreak, financial ruin, and behind it all, a shadow lingered, feeding on her despair. Evelyn jerked her hand away, her breath hitching. What was that? The woman looked at her in confusion. What was what? Evelyn didn't answer. The curse wasn't just within her, it was awake, watching, and aware. That night, Evelyn had another dream. She was standing in the Frostwood Chapel once more, though it was crumbling now, overtaken by vines and snow. The shadow stood before her, its form more solid and imposing than ever. "You are its keeper," it growled, its voice echoing through the hollow space. "The curse is no longer bound to a place, but to you. It seeks sustenance, and you will feed it." "No," Evelyn said, her voice firm. "I won't let it hurt anyone else." The shadow laughed, a low, menacing sound that made her blood run cold. "You cannot resist its nature. It is hunger, it is fear, and now so are you." Evelyn woke drenched in sweat, her hands trembling. She looked at the faint mark on her collarbone, its glow barely perceptible in the darkness. In the following days, Evelyn tried to suppress the curse's influence. She avoided crowded places, refused to engage with strangers, and buried herself in her work. But the hunger inside her grew stronger, gnawing at her sanity. The turning point came one night when Evelyn's neighbor, a kind elderly man named Mr. Thornton, came to her door. He looked frail, his eyes sunken with exhaustion. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, his voice trembling, "but I've been having strange dreams lately. Dark dreams, and, well, I thought you might understand." Evelyn's blood ran cold. "Why would you think that?" Mr. Thornton hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, blackened object. It was a fragment of the original cursed bell. "I found this in my garden," he said. "It appeared after you moved in." Evelyn stared at the fragment, her pulse quickening. The curse was spreading, planting seeds of darkness wherever she went. "You need to get rid of it," she said urgently. "Bury it far away and never touch it again." But as Mr. Thornton nodded and left, Evelyn felt the familiar pull of the curse, a faint whisper in the back of her mind. He's already marked. Over the following days, Mr. Thornton's health deteriorated rapidly. Evelyn could feel his fear and despair radiating through the thin walls of their apartment building. The curse was feeding on him, and no matter how hard Evelyn tried to ignore it, the whispers grew louder. "You can save him." The shadow's voice echoed in her dreams. "Take his burden, relieve him of his suffering." Evelyn fought back tears. She knew what the curse was asking of her. If she embraced it fully, she could stop its spread. But every time she gave in, it would grow stronger within her. Faced with an impossible choice, Evelyn stood outside Mr. Thornton's door one night, her hand hovering over the doorknob. "I can't do this," she whispered to herself. But as she turned to leave, she heard a faint tolling sound, the cursed bell ringing softly in the distance. The choice wasn't hers anymore. Evelyn stood frozen outside Mr. Thornton's door. The faint toll of the cursed bell echoed in her mind, each chime a painful reminder of her role as the keeper. She felt the pull of the curse, urging her to step inside and end the old man's suffering. But she also felt the crushing weight of what it would cost her. Her hand trembled as she knocked lightly on the door. After a moment, it creaked open, and Mr. Thornton appeared. His face was ashen, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. His frailty was more pronounced than ever. "Miss Evelyn," he said, his voice barely audible. "It's gotten worse. The dreams, they won't stop." Evelyn swallowed hard. "May I come in?" The old man nodded, stepping aside to let her enter. His small apartment was dimly lit. the air thick with the scent of illness and despair. On a side table sat the fragment of the cursed bell, wrapped in a cloth. Its presence radiated a faint, malevolent energy that Evelyn could feel in her very bones. "I tried to get rid of it," Mr. Thornton said, his voice quivering, "but every time I bury it, it comes back." Evelyn's gaze lingered on the fragment. The curse wasn't letting him go. It had latched onto his fear and despair, feeding on his very life. She clenched her fists, anger bubbling beneath her fear. "It's not your fault," she said softly. "You didn't ask for this." "But I can't take it anymore," he whispered, tears glistening in his tired eyes. "I just want it to stop." Evelyn's chest tightened. She knew what she had to do, but the thought terrified her. Taking on more of the curse's burden would strengthen it, making it harder to resist. But if she didn't act, Mr. Thornton wouldn't survive much longer. She reached out and placed her hand over his trembling one. "I'll help you," she said. "I promise." Evelyn sat across from Mr. Thornton, the fragment of the bell between them. She closed her eyes, steadying her breath as she prepared to channel the curse away from him. The room grew colder, and the air thickened with an oppressive weight. "Don't be afraid," she whispered, though the words were as much for herself as for him. Placing her hands over the fragment, she focused her thoughts. The whispers grew louder, swirling in her mind like a storm. Images of Frostwood, the chapel, and the shadow flooded her vision. The curse was alive, writhing and resisting her efforts to contain it. As she pulled the dark energy away from Mr. Thornton, she felt its icy tendrils clawing at her soul. The mark on her collarbone burned, glowing faintly beneath her shirt. The fragment trembled under her hands, disintegrating into ash as the transfer completed. When it was over, Mr. Thornton let out a shuddering gasp and slumped back in his chair. His face, though still pale, seemed more peaceful. The dark circles beneath his eyes began to fade. Evelyn, however, felt the weight of the curse deepen within her. The whispers were louder now, incessant and insidious. The shadows in the room seemed to shift and writhe, following her every move. "Thank you," Mr. Thornton said weakly, his voice filled with gratitude. "I feel lighter." Evelyn forced a smile, though her body trembled with exhaustion. "You'll be okay now." But she knew she wouldn't be. In the days that followed, Evelyn's connection to the curse grew stronger. She could no longer deny its influence. Her ability to sense others' emotions became sharper, almost unbearable in crowded places. It wasn't just fear or sorrow she could feel. It was every dark thought and hidden pain people carried. Worse still, the curse began to manifest physically. Her reflection in mirrors no longer mimicked her movements perfectly. Instead, it lingered, watching her with glowing, hollow eyes. Shadows clung to her footsteps, stretching unnaturally in dim light. She began avoiding people altogether, afraid of what the curse might compel her to do. But it wasn't just her fear of harming others, it was the growing temptation to use the curse's power. The whispers no longer begged or taunted. They tempted her with promises of control and strength. "You can shape it," the shadow's voice murmured in her dreams. "It doesn't have to consume you. You can wield it." Evelyn woke one night to find her apartment bathed in darkness, her reflection grinning back at her from every reflective surface. The toll of the bell echoed faintly, and the mark on her collarbone pulsed with a sinister light. She clutched her chest, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't choose this," she whispered. "I never wanted this." But deep down, She feared she was starting to want the power it offered. Evelyn's isolation ended one evening when a knock came at her door. She hesitated, staring at the shadow visible beneath the doorframe. Whoever it was, they hadn't gone away, even as her unease filled the room like a tangible force. Finally, she opened the door to find a man in his early 30s standing there. His piercing blue eyes seemed to see through her, and his expression was a mixture of curiosity and caution. "My name is Adrian," he said. "I know what you are." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "You're the keeper of the curse," he said bluntly. "I've been searching for you." Adrian stepped inside before she could protest, pulling a worn leather journal from his coat. "This curse, it's older than Frostwood, older than the chapel. I've been studying it for years." Evelyn stared at him, her mind racing. "Why? What do you want from me?" "To end it," Adrian said simply. "For good." Evelyn laughed bitterly. "You think I haven't tried? There's no breaking this curse. I'm bound to it now." "That's where you're wrong," Adrian said, opening the journal to a page filled with strange arcane symbols. "The curse is tied to a source. If we find it and destroy it, we can sever its hold. Forever." Evelyn felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly drowned out by the whispers. The curse didn't want to be destroyed, and it was letting her know. The mark on her collarbone burned hotter than ever, a painful reminder of the darkness she carried. "Even if you're right," she said, her voice trembling, "the curse won't let me go without a fight." Adrian met her gaze, his eyes steady. "Then we fight." Adrian's determination rekindled something in Evelyn she hadn't felt since leaving Frostwood. Hope. Despite her fear, she realized that if there was even the faintest chance of ending the curse, she had to take it. "What do you mean by source?" Evelyn asked, her voice steadying. Adrian spread the journal on her table, pointing to a passage written in a language she didn't recognize. "The curse didn't begin in Frostwood. It's far older than that. I've traced it back through centuries of folklore and historical accounts. Every 100 years, it moves. Before Frostwood, it was a coastal village in Scotland. Before that, a monastery in the Alps." Evelyn's brow furrowed. "How do you know it's the same curse?" Adrian tapped the journal. "The descriptions match perfectly. The bell, the symbols, the shadow. And in every case, there's a mention of a relic tied to its origin. It's always described as something ancient, something crafted with the intent to bind a soul." Evelyn felt the mark on her collarbone pulse faintly, as if responding to Adrian's words. "So, you think if we find this relic, we can destroy the curse?" Adrian nodded. "Exactly. The problem is, the relic's location isn't recorded anywhere. But I found clues, traces that lead to a specific region, a place called Eldermore." The name sent a shiver through Evelyn. "Where is it?" "Deep in the forests of Eastern Europe," Adrian said. "If the stories are true, Eldermore was abandoned centuries ago, but it's where the curse first began." The journey to Eldermore was long and grueling. Evelyn and Adrian traveled through snow-covered mountains, dense forests, and desolate villages. The farther they went, the more isolated the world became. By the time they reached the outskirts of Eldermore, it felt as if they'd crossed into another realm entirely. The forest surrounding Eldermore was unnaturally quiet. No birds sang, no animal stirred. The trees loomed like skeletal hands, their bare branches clawing at the gray sky. Adrian parked their car at the edge of the forest, consulting an old map. "The village should be about 2 miles in," he said, his breath visible in the frigid air. Evelyn adjusted her coat, the chill biting through every layer. "What do we do when we find it?" "We look for the relic," Adrian replied. If my research is correct, it'll be in the village chapel or a nearby crypt. But be careful, the curse won't let us take it without a fight. Evelyn didn't need the warning. The mark on her collarbone burned hotter with every step she took toward the cursed village. Eldermore was a ghost town, its ruins half buried in snow. Crumbling stone buildings lined a frozen river, their windows shattered and their roofs caved in. The air was thick with an oppressive energy that made every breath feel labored. Adrian led the way, his journal in hand. The chapel should be up ahead, he said, pointing to a structure at the top of a hill. Its bell tower leaned precariously as if ready to collapse. As they climbed the hill, Evelyn noticed symbols etched into the stones lining the path. They were the same as those she'd seen in Frostwood: spirals, stars, and jagged lines that seemed to pulse faintly as she passed. "The curse's reach is strong here," Adrian murmured. "Be ready for anything." The chapel door was heavy and warped with age, but they managed to push it open. Inside, the air was colder than outside, and the faint tolling of a bell echoed from somewhere deep within. Evelyn's pulse quickened. "It's here," she whispered. Adrian nodded, his eyes scanning the dark interior. "Let's find it." At the back of the chapel, they found a trapdoor hidden beneath a rotting altar. Adrian pried it open, revealing a narrow stone staircase descending into darkness. "Of course," Evelyn muttered. "Why is it always underground?" Adrian smirked faintly. "Wouldn't be a cursed relic if it were easy to find." They descended into the crypt, their flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the scent of decay. At the center of the crypt was a pedestal, and on it sat an object that made Evelyn's blood run cold. A blackened bell, larger and more ornate than the one in Frostwood. Its surface was covered in the same symbols, and it pulsed faintly, as if alive. "This is it," Adrian said, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn stepped closer, the mark on her collarbone burning fiercely. The whispers in her mind grew louder, more insistent. "Destroy it," Adrian urged. "Quickly, before—" A guttural growl cut him off. Evelyn turned to see the shadow emerging from the darkness, its hollow eyes glowing with malevolence. The shadow moved faster than Evelyn had ever seen, its form flickering as it lunged toward them. Adrian shoved her aside, narrowly avoiding its claws. "Keep it busy!" Adrian shouted. "I'll destroy the bell!" Evelyn scrambled to her feet, grabbing a broken piece of wood from the ground. She swung it at the shadow, but it passed through its incorporeal form, leaving her stumbling. The shadow turned on her, its hollow eyes burning brighter. Its voice echoed in her mind, a cacophony of rage and despair. "You cannot destroy me," it growled. "I am eternal." "Not if we end this here," Evelyn shot back, forcing herself to stand her ground. Adrian reached the pedestal and lifted the bell. The symbols on its surface flared to life, and the entire crypt began to shake. "Hurry!" Evelyn shouted, dodging another swipe from the shadow. Adrian raised the bell high and slammed it onto the stone floor with all his strength. The sound that followed was deafening, a resonance that seemed to rip through the very fabric of reality. The shadow let out an ear-piercing scream, its form flickering violently. Evelyn felt the mark on her collarbone burn hotter than ever before, as if it were being torn from her skin. The shadow lunged one final time, but before it could reach her, its form dissolved into ash, scattering into the darkness. When the dust settled, the crypt was silent. The bell lay in pieces, its power extinguished. Evelyn collapsed to her knees, clutching her chest. The mark on her collarbone had disappeared, leaving only a faint scar. The whispers were gone, and for the first time in what felt like forever, her mind was her own. Adrian helped her to her feet, his face pale but triumphant. "It's over," he said. Evelyn nodded, tears streaming down her face. "We did it." As they climbed out of the crypt and stepped into the light of dawn, the oppressive energy that had hung over Eldermoor was gone. The forest felt alive again, the air lighter. The curse had been broken. Months later, Evelyn sat in her apartment, typing the final lines of her article. She had documented everything: Frostwood, the curse, and their journey to Eldermoor. It was a story the world needed to hear, even if few would believe it. As she finished, she glanced at the small scar on her collarbone, a reminder of what she had endured. The darkness was gone, but the lessons it had taught her remained. Across the city, Adrian was busy compiling his research into a book. Their paths had diverged, but the bond they shared would always connect them. And though the curse was gone, Evelyn knew she would never forget the tolling of the bell, or the strength it had taken to silence it.